Welcome back to UC Davis Live. I'm Satirius Johnson. In 1970, UC Davis psychology professor Robert Sommer created Blacks and Whites, a socially conscious Monopoly-style game intended to teach the realities of race in America. 50 years later, two comedians have produced an updated version of the game. Sommer died in 2021, and the UC Davis Library has now collected his papers and early drafts of the game. Joining us today to talk about the history of Blacks and Whites is the updated version and the intersection of board games and racial justice are Kevin Miller. He's head of archives and special collections and university archivist at UC Davis Shields Library. He coordinates the long-term preservation and access of UC Davis faculty research assets and university records of enduring historical value. Also, Nehemiah, Markos, and Jed Feiman, writers and comedians based in New York City, forming the comedy duo, Never Sad. They're the creators of the updated version of Blacks and Whites. Welcome to you.
Good to be here.
Good to be here.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. And just a reminder to our viewers, if you're watching us live, we are taking your questions. Just leave them in the comment section and we'll work in as many as we can. So Kevin, let's start with you. Tell us about the history of Blacks and Whites. How did a psychology professor come to create a board game?
Yeah, so Professor Sommer was what we call an environmental psychologist. So he was extremely eclectic in his research. He dabbled in mental illness and the built environment, from everything from farmers markets to airport terminals as you're waiting for your flight. And so his interest was in how the environment kind of affects our experiences and even how we think. And so he kind of turned his attention to like a specialty within psychology called simulation design, and got very interested in games. He played Monopoly as a kid himself and enjoyed the game, but also saw that it was very problematic, in terms of turning people into capitalists and so on. But also, he didn't think it really reflected reality, and so his interest then turned to turning that game into something that kind of reflected the backgrounds of different players. So some players, being black or whites, don't start with an even playing field. And so the rules of the game kind of acknowledge that. And so that was his idea, and he developed it with Judy Tart. So that was part of his, what we call faculty papers, that eventually came to the library.
Right. And what kind of attention did Blacks and Whites, the game, get at the time when it was released back in 1970?
Yeah, well, it apparently did pretty well. By his own records, he says it sold over 1,000 copies. It was released through Psychology Today magazine, originally as kind of a pullout in the center of the magazine, something they were doing for a while, I guess. So you could just pull it out and start playing. And they also sold it through mail order in a box like a regular game. So we got a copy of that game, and we also got a lot of the records that he produced in producing that game. And so I gather there were several sort of experiments like this with gamification in the early 70s that, tried to take on social issues. But this one, I think, did better than others.
Right. Today we think of Monopoly as this kind of, capitalist board game, but the original game was developed by a woman named Elizabeth McGee, and she called it a landlord's game, right? And it was kind of a way to illustrate how unregulated capitalism just makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. So in a way, Blacks and Whites is actually closer to the original Monopoly game than today's regular Monopoly is.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I think people forget that Monopoly had these sort of subversive origins.
So now, Maya and Jed, how did you even hear about a 50-year-old board game, and why did you decide to kind of update it?
Yeah, I'll let Jed, go ahead.
Well, in addition to being, comedy writers, we're also news junkies. So a copy of the game came across one of my feeds and had never heard of the game before. It's kind of a shocking title, Blacks and Whites. Nehemiah and I are a comedy duo. We produce, videos regarding race and socially conscious themes. So this was right up our alley. We thought it was, I sent it to him immediately. We thought this was kind of a hilarious, just dated board game. You could go on, Nehemiah. What did you think?
Yeah, news junkie. Jed's being generous. I avoid the news at all costs, but he likes to stay abreast. So yeah, he found it. Obviously, it's kind of like the title itself is provocative, even at the time, which was it was probably more acceptable then, or people weren't so quick to kind of skirt the issue. It was. I'm sure he still knew what he was doing with the title, and if at least it got our attention. So Jed sent it to me, and we said one day we'll do something with this. We didn't know what, because it was still pre-pandemic, so we were busy out trying to do live comedy and filming sketches and all the things that we normally do. We said one day we'll come back to it, and then the pandemic hit, and it was just sitting there on his shelf, and he was like, "Hey, let's come back to this." And it was kind of, we just, it was synchronistic, but unfortunately, it was also just kind of the timing with. I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm blanking with George Floyd.
George Floyd and the pandemic.
All of the current events that were going on at the time, like it was a real bad kind of recipe, but it allowed us to kind of sit back and think about like what we what we do as comedians and creators, and we had this thing in front of us, and we're like, this is unfortunately still kind of appropriate, and now there's never been a better time to sit down and work on a board game, which is so different than anything we've ever done, but it kind of just felt right in a wrong way.
Yeah. So so like, you usually do things like video, sketches and things like that. So you could have done like a sketch about the game, but you guys decided to actually update it. Like, that's what made you kind of take that big step, kind of like, hey, let's kind of do our own version of this game.
I think when we originally, heard about the game, it just sounded like something we made, kind of. We have made videos, regarding our relationship and social issues, but it just for some reason sounded like something that we would have come up with. And 2020 pandemic, we weren't performing on stage. We weren't filming videos because, obviously the pandemic. In addition to it being an uproar of a year, as Nehemiah mentioned, like George Floyd and Black Lives Matter. And then on top of that, it was exactly 50 years. It was not 49 years. It was not 51. It seemed like it was the universe or something was telling us that it was time for us to kind of update it and figure out what we would want to keep about it and what we wanted to update. But here's also the thing. It's not like we could just create it. We found Robert Sommer, Professor Sommer's contact information on the internet, cold emailed him. We discovered from his wife, who would respond to his emails, that he was 91, and thought that it was a great idea, that it was completely relevant for today, and we proceeded.
Like Jed said, we had no blueprint for this. This is unlike anything we've ever done. But the pandemic was also unprecedented, right? Like we've never lived through something like that. So it was kind of everything felt uprooted, and people didn't know what they were doing and where they were going. And it kind of it felt like it was a kind of a good way to process also. It was like distracting, but also we were able to focus on that and like process things through that. So that wasn't the intention, but it just served as a way to do that. And we like every little aspect of it was new to us. So we had to figure out, we started by contacting the family, getting their blessing, approval, and then kind of just doing our own research on people who like have made board games in the past. And then we had to decide how we wanted to change it, how much we wanted to keep the same and update. So every bit was like new and exciting, and we didn't know what we were doing. We still don't know what we're doing, but it was, I think it came out pretty well. And I'm proud of what we did. I think it's still relevant and still there's something to learn from, and it's entertaining. At the end of the day, we're comedians, and it's like, it is a funny game. So yeah,
that's great. As a reminder, if you're watching us live, we are taking your questions. Just leave them in the comment section and we'll work in as many as we can. So I was wondering if you could give us like a quick overview of Blacks and Whites, how it's played, what's the object, and how does it illustrate disparities?
Sure. Well, Jed, you want to?
Sure. I mean, it's a very interesting concept that originally gripped our attention, where inequality is instituted in the game. And I can't really think, Kevin maybe, but I can't think of another game like that where the rules are different for different players, and specifically race in this case. Yeah. And so it's very similar to Monopoly. You're moving around the board by rolling dice, but access to opportunities are different based on which racial identity you're playing with, as well as the starting money. Black players start with $10,000 and white players start with $1 million, which of course is not a literal, we were not going to statistics and trying to make this literal, but it's a metaphor for instituted inequality. And that's, yeah, so it's very similar to playing like Monopoly. You're taking cards and moving around the board, but it's much harder if you're a Black player, unless you work together, which was part of the original game.
That was well, it wasn't at first, right? I think originally right. Professor Sommer, he had kind of made it as close to real life as possible, in which all the rules were stacked against you. There's like very blatant, just racist practices in real estate and just the law. And his point was to show his family first. It was he was playing with his children, and then his students secondly, that life is not like that. And it seems silly, it seems trite, almost like condescending to say something so simple, but people are still raised and kind of brought up in education systems where that's really not made a reality to them. And they're kind of just taught like, let's just not think about that and not talk about that. And if you're just a good person, then you can live your life guilt-free because you've done nothing wrong. And that's not the point. The point is that these institutions are in place and they're still very impactful, and they affect people's lives on a daily basis. And life is not like that. So yeah, Monopoly is a game of fantasy. It's a game of escapism, even though you don't really escape into anything but the reality of disparity anyway, because if you play it, it's just one person owns everything and then the rest. So it's like, it's still realistic, but it's not realistic in that anybody can become that person, when unfortunately, even that's not the case. So yeah, Professor Sommer's intention was to very much highlight that. And then Psychology Today implemented that what Jed was talking about, that like built-in institutional racism, where you could work together. So the Psychology Today version kind of encouraged Black people to work together and change the rules and find ways to overcome using collective effort, which is still like a big kind of idea in like socialism and just general things that are anti-capitalist. So yeah, we kind of kept the Psychology Today aspect and put that in the rule book. If you actually read the rule book, it's not that long, but we put kind of clues in there that like, yes, the game is designed to kind of be depressing if you think about it, how things are pretty much futile, but you can still change the rules and work together and kind of recreate the narrative for yourself. So that was the idea.
Right, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess, a parallel to Monopoly is that there are properties along the board that players land on, and you have different like properties kind of in groups. You have different groups of properties. Can you talk about the disparities when different players land on different areas of the board?
Sure. Yeah, like, so if you're a Black player, you don't have to pay taxes in like the 1% like neighborhoods, right? That's one thing. If you're there's certain neighborhoods. Now we actually instituted we've made a Go Brandon variant pack, which is like a booster pack of like new cards and new rules. And now there's like vaccination like rules where if you are vaxxed, it kind of allows you to buy a property in different places and like and use certain like the railroads or the transit systems that are on the board. And if you're not, you can't. But also, I don't know, what's another like.
But yeah, the original game had 4 type of zones, and as Nehemiah was saying, the original estate zone, Black players couldn't own a property there until they had like $1 million in assets, which is very hard in the game. And that was one of the things. One of the zones in the original game was called the ghetto zone, which I don't think is, of the things we wanted to update, some of the language was kind of dated for the time. So that was the ungentrified zone, I think, was our version.
So Jed and I aren't shy about kind of like using whatever language we feel like fit to kind of express our ideas or get the joke across. But we deliberated on the ones that were like, is it not going to be clear, like where we stand on like these words and their implications and where they come from, So like ghetto was like one of the biggest ones. We changed that to the integrated zone? Ungentrified zone, yeah. Which also is the comment. Gentrification was not accounted for in the original Blacks and Whites game. So that's one one of the major changes that we put was kind of how these neighborhoods have gentrified and transformed over time. So some of the neighborhoods that would have been ghetto back then are now like the gentrified or damn near the suburban zones, you know, like Harlem, the historically Black neighborhood, which at the time of the original game was like very much a Black stronghold, is now very gentrified and very different. So that's like in a different neighborhood. Same with, I can't think of another one off the top of my head, but there's a few of those that we kind of had to shift, and we had to think about those because it's not necessarily like a hard, like, you know, line demarcation. It's like not a hard science as far as what neighborhoods can be classified as what. So we did have to kind of think about them and talk about it. And like, we kind of chose neighborhoods that wouldn't be too like polarizing, or kind of people would be like, I don't know, I wouldn't really classify that there. We kind of just made the more obvious ones. Like no one's going to argue that Harlem is expensive now. That's like not even
right.
Whereas Detroit,
if you're watching us live, you can if you have any questions, you can just leave them in the comments section. We'll work in as many as we can. Who did I just interrupt there?
Oh, I was just going to add that if you picture the original Monopoly board and like Boardwalk and Park Place, that's the 1% now, or what Professor Sommer called the estate community, and then the purples and the blues are what he called the ghetto, and so it kind of goes around the board like that. There's also the chance cards that he called opportunity cards, and that's where a lot of the humor of the game comes in, I think, which is really important. So like, there was different cards for whether you were a Black player or a white player, and so an example of a white card is you get a profitable construction contract from the government for urban renewal, collect $250,000 from the treasury, and kick back $50,000 to each white landlord in the ghetto. Meanwhile, an example of a Black card, and this is pretty dated, Mayor Daley reelected, you are taken directly to the police station for interrogation. So separate and unequal.
Love a Mayor Daley joke, but yeah, it
but a lot of people
trying
don't
to
remember
update it. Right.
And some were easy to update because like that kind of idea, even though we did have to change Mayor Daley, we kind of kept the idea that certain people, like if you're white people, can be easily kind of rehabilitated or just kind of talked out of things, or the consequences are just different, right? So black people can be sent to jail for something that white people are just like encouraged to do, pretty much. You want to talk about protesting. So we encountered for that by like installing the reparations pool, right? Where the peaceful protest, which is like a zone in the board that can be, for white people, it can be like a benefit. Whereas if you're Black and you land there, you can be sent to jail for being at the peaceful protest. So it's the same, similar idea. So like, even though that joke was already from the 70s, it still fits. You just have to kind of change the specifics, the references. So a lot of it was changing references, and then a lot of it was kind of how to translate like what's different. And unfortunately, not too much has changed, honestly. There's really not much different when it comes to like race relations.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, other than the kind of the gentrified, ungentrified thing, which sounds like it was like a major difference. I mean, I was going to ask, like, what other kind of social realities or, current events may have informed your updated version that was different from the original, Professor Sommer's version?
I think, Nehemiah mentioned, so reparations has been more in conversation, I think, now than back then. And so, we added a new space called the Reparations Pool, where it's kind of like free parking in Monopoly, where white players in other spaces would be donating money to it to feel good about themselves. And then eventually, if a Black player would land on the reparations pool, they could dole out the money to whoever they see fit, Black players or anybody. I think another thing clearly that's different is references to the internet. We wanted to bring in the internet and social media, just especially because it is like a product. We wanted it to be kind of fun. So maybe the 100th anniversary, people have no idea what the internet is, but we wanted to kind of take a little bit of a millennial approach and some millennial humor to it.
Like
so,
this card, I imagine like, for the 100th anniversary, when two new comedians decide to update our version, it's like there's cards, opportunity cards, where we're talking about like a Barack Obama retweeting you. So, and like that.
No idea. Who was Barack Obama? Yeah.
Right. Like, who is Barack Obama? What is a retweet? Why are you all of a sudden rich now because you were retweeted by somebody? So things like that,
Right.
which make sense in our context, but we're prepared to, like, you know, kind of lose to time eventually.
And in part, it was fun for us, I think, to kind of also make fun of the social media and internet aspects. It is definitely, I mean, that's part of our humor too. We, things that seem sincere might also have like an ironic side to it. I think the original game also had that kind of aspect where some of the cards were super dry, and we want to think that it was an intentional humor. It was being sincere and also like ironic, kind of a dark wry humor. And we definitely wanted to keep, but bring it into like a 21st century. Yeah, that's a good example. Like Barack Obama retweeted your Venmo handle. Should you be excited about that? Is that
like what is that? It's kind of dark that in a way, but it's still like on the surface a cheery like opportunity card, like yay. But yeah, why is that? Like, why are our presidents tweeting? You know.
Yeah. Right. And like, you know, the fact that you're using humor to kind of, you know, get your point across, that is a very powerful tool. But do you think games can really influence how people think about issues like race?
No, not at all.
Not at all. Anybody?
I think the main thing the games can do is just get people talking. And I think the conversations are what's going to do it. A game is not going to change anybody's opinion on anything. And it's hardly going to teach anybody anything, but it can start conversations. And the main, I think the biggest point is that people aren't having these conversations. The reason things haven't changed in 50 years is because people are like, we're just at home. We're not talking about race. We're not talking about redlining. We're not talking about just even modern day racist practices where people are just appraised differently based on race or shown different homes or just encouraged or discouraged out of neighborhoods. Like, you don't have those conversations until you're old enough to be in the market now and you just kind of experience it. And then you want to kind of hide your kids from it. Or if you don't experience it, then why even bring it up? So yeah, the whole point is to get people to have the conversations, and then hopefully they can learn something from their own research, or if they happen to be speaking to somebody that can teach them something, if they're lucky.
I might not take as definitive of a no as Nehemiah just did, because there were people in the history of like us working on this who did say that they had the original game and they bought the new one, but the original game, they remember memories of kind of learning about race, and maybe they're not in New York City like we are, and this was maybe the first time that they actually thought of this, and the game itself was kind of like a teaching tool. I think it started as a teaching tool with Professor Sommer. So yeah, I wouldn't say that. I would say that there were probably people who maybe it opened their minds to a new reality. And I don't know if that's changing.
For sure. If we're talking about like have board games or have they ever had the potential to do so, then yeah, I take that back. I'm sure plenty of people learn from board games before the internet, but nobody's going to learn something from a board game that they didn't already see online at this point. Even if you're, we're all in our bubbles on
that might be true. That might be true. Who we would have to find out. Kevin could tell us later on if our game influenced anybody, but I think the original, perhaps, definitely.
So far, our game has mostly just angered people who don't understand metaphors. That's mainly.
It was definitely one of the goals of Professor Sommer that players would play opposite to their race in the game, and that was in the most interesting and instructive. And the goal was to develop empathy and understanding. Sort of walking metaphorically in somebody else's shoes, at least during the kind of framed period of the game. And it could have small ways of moving the needle for individuals.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you guys are more optimistic than I am.
So how long has your version of the game been out, and how has the reception been so far?
So we launched it on Kickstarter. That was we've never made a board game before, and have learned since that Kickstarter is very popular. Board games is one of the top categories there. So we launched it on Kickstarter, tried to get as much momentum and press as possible for that. And yeah, it was, we've sold, copies. We also wanted to include a charitable element. So I think the original game was just a Psychology Today capitalistic venture, but proceeds from all of our games that we've sold, a portion have gone to the National Urban League's housing division, which just felt like another I think that was, we didn't mention it yet, but that was one of the reasons as well that we wanted to bring it back, because especially, during George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, it was just, it seems like it didn't seem right just to bring back the game unless there was something that it could do to help the cause also.
I think that was sort of like a reinforcement, like just in case this game wasn't doing what we wanted it to do, just to kind of have a little backup. Like, we are trying to actually make a positive impact with it. And it's, it's talking about housing. So we figured, why not partner with a national organization that can actually directly affect housing. And we've done events with like local New York housing organizations. We had like we went to one event there where we got like a lot of good attention and people kind of engaging with the content. The only thing so far as like media goes, we've gotten one pretty great article by Wired from a friend of ours, Sebastian. He's a great journalist, but we're waiting for it to get picked up by more people. And I think it's the name, which is the main thing we like talked about. Like, do we keep the name? Do we change it? And we chose to keep it. And I still want to stand by that, but I do think that's the main thing holding it back, because people see that. And we're in a social climate now where people don't necessarily want to engage with things head on. They want to there's like, it has to be a nice marketed media strategy to talk about race. You can't just be kind of blunt with it.
Right. Interesting. So Kevin, Sommer's widow, Barbara, has given the UC Davis Library his papers, the original Blacks and White game, and letters related to it. So what do you plan to do with all of that?
Yeah, it's been wonderful to work with Barbara. What we do in this part of the library is we bring in material that is different from your usual library book. It doesn't circulate, get checked out, but we do offer it here on site for people to come in and look at, or as much as we can, we try to digitize things so that people can access them online. But, I think it is the most interesting job in the library, because I get to oversee the collection of all this rare and unique material, stuff that doesn't fit in other places. And so with Professor Sommer, it was his file on the game, which he was meticulous about, and I love him for it. But it was just this very concise collection of notes, correspondence, photographs, drafts that just, really reads like a novel when you flip through it, and it tells the story of how the game was developed, how it changed. There's foldouts of mock-ups that he and Judy created of, the game as it changed from Monopoly to what they were calling model cities to ultimately Blacks and Whites. And so it's a small collection, but it's a really great collection. It also complements the other material we got from him in his other areas of research.
That's right. Do you plan on maybe putting them on exhibit or anything like that?
Yeah. So, first of all, we'll tell the research world and the world that it's available, through our usual channels in the catalog, and people will be able to come in and access it. We don't have any immediate plans for an exhibit. We did collaborate with some local media and had professors Bruce Haynes and Jorge Pena come in and play the game, and just to get some publicity and kind of show, the impact that the original game had on Nehemiah and Jed, and how they relaunched the game and so on. But I would love to at some point. Yeah.
That's great. So just to wrap up, Jed, Nehemiah, any final thoughts to leave with people as, we're talking about the new version of Blacks and Whites?
It's a good game, and there's definitely, it's just as, sadly, I mean, our comedy duo is called Never Sad, and sadly, it's a fun game that is both just as relevant as it was 50 years ago. I think that was partly why Professor Sommer, when we talked to him before he passed, he agreed to, he thought it was a great idea to update. He even did write he wrote a note in a forward in our instruction pamphlet, which it is there, and maybe that was one of the, the later last things that he had written, but we found this game by chance, and people who have found it on our website or Kickstarter, I think they've had the same experience as us originally. They thought, wow, this is a game. Is this real? And it sounds funny, and it sounds very interesting. And definitely the experience of playing the game is something that's different than any other game. The institutionalized, inequality, I think, is something that we were fascinated by, and it continues to be interesting and engaging.
I second that. I think it's a funny game. It's no one who's bought it has complained. People who have complained are the people who haven't bought it. So if that says anything, we've yet to figure out a way to kind of flip that and use that to our advantage. But we've gotten a lot of anger from people who really just don't want to have this conversation, or think that we're in a post-racial society, or think that we're in a reverse racist society where, we're really just trying to keep the working white man down. And that's not the case, but it is it's a nuanced, interesting, and ultimately funny game that a lot of, good people worked hard on. Our artist, Erica Cottrell, she did an amazing job. It's a beautiful game, if anything. And it's great. I think it pays homage to Professor Sommer, who is a brilliant and fascinating man. And I think we did our best comedically to kind of bring these like sensitive topics to light in a fun and accessible way.
Well, this has been really great. I want to thank you all so much for coming on today and sharing your work. Kevin Miller is head of archives and special collections and university archivist at UC Davis Shields Library. And Nehemiah Markos and Jed Feiman are the comedy duo Never Sad, also co-creators of the updated version of Blacks and Whites. They're based in New York City. Thank you so much for watching UC Davis Live. Until next time, I'm Satirius Johnson, and tune in for our next UC Davis Live in a couple weeks.